Hi, this is Michelle Hauk, and today we are on to the implementation phase of ADDIE. The first quote I found from the reading was from the Surrey document, in which it said there's no specific activities that instructional designers can point to as occurring in the implementation phase. The implementation phase is often dismissed with the simplistic prescription that after development, the product is implemented prior to evaluation. And to be honest, this is exactly how I felt and still kind of feel about the implementation phase. Um, I think of all the phases we've done so far, this one has by far been the most difficult, especially when it came to later on coming up with my own definition. Um, it is an important phase, of course. Without implementation, you've just created a lot of stuff and done a lot of research, but you haven't been putting it into action. Um, so like it says, so this is another quote that talks about how its implementation is considered like the mystery phase. Um, but it goes on to say that instructional designers must work to unravel this mystery to ensure that their instructional products are implemented successfully. So, familiarizing themselves with changes in theories, models, and strategies, as well as becoming knowledgeable about what factors and variables facilitate implementation. I thought this was interesting because just implementing something isn't really just enough. Um, you want your product to be implemented successfully. So, looking at the changes in the way instruction works, and putting that back when you're doing the development phase is going to mean that your implementation is more successful. If you're creating things without models, the strategies, and the current theories, then your implementation won't be successful. So I found that implementation is really tied to the phases that surround it. If what you've designed and developed isn't good, then your implementation won't be successful. And implementation and evaluation are also very closely tied together. I liked this list of factors that contributed to successful implementation. I thought that was really interesting. I pulled the three that resonated with me most. I think for teachers, especially, these three are the reasons why we develop our own materials. The first one is dissatisfaction with the status quo. Having insufficient or ineffective materials leads you to create your own. That's so true as a teacher, especially when you're given things that don't work for the context of your classroom or don't make sense. So we implement new materials, right? So dissatisfaction with the status quo, I think, is the number one reason teachers implement new strategies in their classroom, because the way that they have been in the past doesn't work. Knowledge and skills. So looking at the current levels and realizing you need to do something different. You need to implement new information. And then the last one is leadership, an active involvement by immediate supervisors, in this case mostly principals or the heads of departments, supporting and encouraging you to implement and try new things. If you're lucky enough to be at a supportive school, this definitely helps you have the confidence to implement new ideas. So from a teacher standpoint, I found these three reasons of implementation to really speak to me. Last but not least, I have this quote from Peterson that says, "No product, course, or program can be effective without conducting an evaluation and necessary revisions throughout the implementation phase. When the learners and instructors are active contributors in the implementation, modifications can be made instantaneously to the course or program to ensure effectiveness." I feel like of all the things I read, all the definitions I looked at, and all the different materials, this spoke to me the most. While implementation is its own phase, I feel that it has a strong connection to the evaluation phase. As a teacher, especially, implementing and evaluating are happening, just like the quote says, instantaneously. You're making minute changes. You're thinking of how it's working or how it's not working as it's happening, especially because, like I talked about in earlier phases, you don't have necessarily a team of people to bounce lessons off of to help you develop them, or design them with a team. So the evaluation phase is happening mostly during um, implementation, right? As you're teaching it, as you're putting it into use, you're thinking, is this working? Is this not working? What do I need to change? And you're making those changes as they're happening, because in the classroom, bad lessons don't work, and you don't want to torture yourself through a bad lesson. So hopefully you have a couple different strategies up your sleeve to kind of alter it and change it as it's going. Or at the end of the day, you think, oh man, that did not work. And how am I going to change it and implement something new for the next course, right? Because nobody wants to do that a few times over. So I created my definition of implementation and said implementation is putting all the developed work into action. The lessons and materials are given to the instructor to be used in the environment it was intended with the audience it was made for. It is the process of seeing how all the planning and creating works out in the real world. So I think this says it, right? I mean, implementation is about really putting the theoretical into the practical. You're taking your ideas and you're saying, great, this all works, in the lab or in my brain, or in the ideal situation of how I think it's going to go. And let's see if that's true. And if it's not, how am I going to change it, right? Which becomes evaluation. So it's the process of seeing how it really functions, how it really works. And in some cases, especially I guess in the corporate world, or maybe if you're teaching in a team, it's how does it work for someone else? I think the concept of creating lessons to be taught by other people is really interesting, because as a singular teacher, sometimes I create things because I know they're going to work for me. But I think implementation and part of the ADDIE process is making sure they work for other people as well. And then why it matters. Without implementation, the creation, everything you've done into this point has no purpose. If it's not used outside in the outside world, it's just theory. Implementation makes the product real. So you're changing something from an idea to a real life thing. And that can be really telling of all the work you've done before, but it also can be really inspiring. If something you work so hard on, you can see it practically being used and working, and that can really inspire you to keep creating and keeping that process going, right? Snowballing into more work. But that's the implementation phase. Like I said, I think of all the phases, this is the hardest one to kind of come up with a definition for. It feels very mysterious, as the definition earlier had said. But I think it's really the phase that makes all the work worth it. Because if you don't implement it, if you don't put it into action, no one's benefiting. So while this, I think, may be one of the most important phases, it's also kind of the most mysterious. All right, see you next week.